Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
Hi. So, in the last episode, we were talking about technique. What does technique mean? How does FM Alexander use the word technique? And how is it used in the modern Alexander technique? And how you use the concept differently in the initial Alexander technique? So, over to you, Jeando.
Yes, we are going to develop, and at first I wanted to make just a cycle, and I had an idea of a title because it's appropriate. It's use, form, and function. But in fact, the title is really catchy, but it hides the idea mainly instead. But very often when you use a form affect, well, a very common sentence like use affect functioning, something student of the Alexander technique have heard time and time again, you lose in fact the purpose of Alexander, because the words have become like a motto, like something that everybody would believe into without really investigating what's behind. So I much prefer to expand. And so the best title would be for use forming functioning would be use of instructions, the form of the torso, and the concept of functioning as a whole. This is the technique of construction's aim, the goal, and this is why I think we need to expand on the idea of technique of construction and speak about these three different concepts. So I want to come back to something that we've said last time, which was central, is that Alexander was saying that the consideration of the technique is necessary, and for him that means the technique means the means whereby the principles are to be carried out, and it's important to understand that Alexander had a view on these principles, and for him, these were coordinating principles. And sometimes the word principle is a bit frightening or difficult to understand. A principle is a rule of very general application, a rule that you can apply all the time. And I think that people will understand what we mean by rule is that in certain condition, when this or this appears, then it's the if, and then if this happened, then I will react in this way. So that's a rule. And obviously, a rule is verbal. You have it's a very handy way to memorize uh, rules of actions. So instructions for us are intentions for later, are messages that we send, and we need to send messages because Alexander was discussing coordinating principles. He was discussing coordinating movements. So a series of movements happening at the same time. So if you want to direct a coordination, well, you need to develop a mindset where you can have an intention, delay its application, delay its performance in order to think a second intention, so that what a second instruction would be, and delay also that instruction, having in mind now an external rule that says that you want instruction one and instruction two to be performed at the same time later, so that you can add even more instructions. This is how Alexander construct an idea that is to coordinate instructions. It's something that is written in the books, and very often people don't notice that there is on one side coordinating instructions. This is the moment when you rehearse your orders. This is the giving of the orders in a coordinated way. And then there is a performance, something that you can film with a video camera. This is this is the setting we have during the long distance lesson. I ask the student to listen to a certain number of instructions, trying not to act on it, trying not to feel what each instruction separately would be like. We don't want that. We have to understand that one instruction separately will lead to an incorrect coordination, because that instruction will not be totally separate. This instruction, according to Alexander's principle of unity in activity, will happen on a specific part of the organism, and all the other movements of the other parts of the organism are going still to be directed by the feeling sense, the whole system of guidance. So you will have a battle. And the issue of the battle is easy to imagine. You are trying to perform one new movement while all the other movements of the organism are still on the old mode of feeling direction, so they will win. You will have the impression of doing the right thing. You will release some parts. Well, if you were filmed at that moment, it could be pointed out to you that there are many other movements that are happening, and many of them are exactly against the overall aim, the overall end that we want. For example, we could want a certain form, a certain shape of the organism. And because the person has not been able or has not been taught to coordinate instructions all together, the person will never approach the aim that Alexander has defined. So for that, it's better to go back to the books and see this. Alexander is talking about the shape or form. And he says that when the instructions given are carefully followed, the effect upon the whole mechanical mechanism of the person concerned is shown by the fact that when the coordinating principles brought about by this method are established, there is a constant tendency for the torso to lengthen. Whereas the usual tendency, due to faulty standing position and the incorrect coordination which follow, is for the torso to shorten. It's good to stop a little moment and have a look at this statement. So Alexander, of course, has created a technique based on instructions. So a person is using instructions in order to perform a series of actions. And he says that these instructions have to be carefully followed. So you must obey the instructions. And as I've explained just earlier, the coordinating principles have to be established both at the level of the instructions. The subject must understand that we are asking for coordinated messages, coordinated orders. And when these are established, then there will be a coordinated activity of the different parts. And we see that here Alexander is pointing to the torso, to the mechanism of the torso, and not to the whole system. Is really pinpointing the mechanism of the torso. And so we discover that Alexander manipulate different movements in his mind in order to coordinate these movements. This is called manipulation. It's a mental manipulation. And because of this mental manipulation, he's able, of course, to, well, project these intentions in action. And as a result of this projection, we see a certain tendency for the torso to lengthen. I insist on the certain tendency because you will find that there are different ways to understand or to translate the meaning of these words. So we see on the left, FM Alexander is seen squatting. It's a very famous photo. And on the right, there is one of the students at the very first training course before Pat McDonald started his. So this is Charles Neal. And they are seen doing the squat. And of course, the tendency for the torso to lengthen is the same in both of us. We see that there is a very, very flat back. There is also, at a certain moment, a curve that is appearing, and it was called at the time the hump. I remember two different people. There is Marjorie Barlow that said that the head had to be directed forward and up from the hump. And from the hump, when you watch the images, after a while, you start to realize that in all Alexander's images and the very first training course, all the students were performing according to instructions in order to lengthen the back. And around T7, T7 is the name for the seventh thoracic vertebra process, around that spot, we can see that suddenly they have organized the upper torso to come forward and up. Not forward and down, but forward and up. So it's necessary when you read the book to get an idea of what you mean by lengthening and widening the back or lengthening and widening the torso. And for me, the best way was to look at Alexander performance of the instructions. And you will see very often this can be compared with other performances, with other people that have a different, apparently, conception of what it is for the torso to lengthen. And for example, here is one. I was discussing this yesterday. We have Marjorie Barlow, and she's a student of Alexander, of course, and a teacher, a well-known teacher. And when I compare their expression of the coordination of the movements of the parts of the torso, suddenly there is something that is surprising. That the translation of the first, coordinated principles is completely different. They are not organizing the movements of the part of the torso according to the same principles at all. And that has led to, of course, some remarks. Many people have, been really infuriated by the fact that I could look at first generation teacher and observe the way they were performing the lengthening of the back. And this has led to some saying that there were some a form of shape fascism, and that the modern Alexander technique, being somatic in essence, doesn't really control these things, and consider that controlling the shape of the torso is bad manners first, yes, and so it's not important. What is important is the direction in the mind of the person. If the person feels that her neck is free, that's it, that's fine. I find it very, very difficult to understand. Because when you look at this shape fascism idea, which is a bit gross, but there is something true in it, and I'm a bit of a culprit here, because what I wanted to show also is that the modern Alexander technique on the right has, a different understanding of what is to lengthen the back, but also it has a responsibility in teaching. And when I published some paper some time ago, and there was this image, and I think that the shape fascism accusation came from it. When you look at the modern Alexander technique teachers and students nowadays, you will find that these are all photographs I've taken on the internet, and I place in the center a question where you see that Alexander in sitting is always performing the same configuration, the same organization of the movements of the different parts of the torso that leads to, yes, this concept that there is a thoracic curve, and that one should not flatten the thoracic curve. And so when you look at the representation you see on the internet of the modern Alexander technique, these are all pictures of modern Alexander teachers working. You find that their conception is to flatten the upper torso. They have a flat back conception that goes right to the diagram they are showing as proper. Their conception is really geometric also. So my defense against the shape fascism accusation is very simple. Look at your own. It's that this conception of lengthening the back is really everywhere. These are pictures coming from many, many different parts in the world, many different modern Alexander technique associations, the STAT ones and also the other ones. So I think it's interesting to, ask the question of the coordinating principles we are following. And why is it that we are following coordinating principles? Because there are coordinating principles brought about by the two methods. By the initial Alexander technique. Alexander is seen performing some movements which lead to an organization of the torso, while the somatic Alexander technique, the one that is based on released and absolutely giving correct experience to the pupil, well, the correct experience that is given to the pupil in the modern Alexander technique is surprisingly different from the experience that Alexander was able to promote in himself and also in the very first training course when he was in charge. And so after that, when Pat MacDonald and Marjorie Barlow started to take preeminence, we can see that there was a completely different change, which is that it was the time when suddenly the idea was to have the head forward and up was something to do with the neck and head direction. It has nothing, it was gone, the idea that head forward and up was head forward and up from the back going back, as Alexander is seen performing here. So that's first of all, that's a questioning. You have to understand that when you're an Alexander teacher and you're immersed in the somatic technique, I was myself a somatic teacher using touch. Well, at first it's a very difficult questioning because you are up against all these senior teachers, all these people that have been teaching for more than 20 or 30 years, and they have a certain say in the matter, of course. Their experience counts, but their experience is different from FM Alexander experience. So what is coordinating correctly? How could we make sense of this idea of coordinating correctly? So Alexander, really centers that question of coordinating correctly. The question is not of correct position, but of correct coordination of the muscular mechanism concerned. Moreover, anyone who has acquired the power of coordinating correctly can readjust the parts of his body to meet the requirement of almost any position. while always commanding adequate and correct movements of the respiratory apparatus and perfect vocal control, a fact which I demonstrate daily to my pupils. Continual readjustments of the parts of the body without undue physical tension is most beneficial and is proved by the high standard and long life, the high standard of health and long life of acrobats. We are going to see how to become acrobats ourselves. So when we are discussing shape fascism, there is something that is necessary to have in mind when we discuss shape, form. It's, in fact, one will assume a shape for Alexander. The question is not of the correct position. No, no, no. It's a question of what movements of the different parts of the torso are necessary to assume the position. This is the power of coordinating correctly. So again, here we must start to ask ourselves question: what is coordination? So you will find that I have a special translation. I have a different view on that. For me, coordination is coordination of movements. So I made some changes in the sentence. The changes are shown by the square brackets. When you see square brackets in my translation, it means that the words are not part of Alexander's original text. So, for example, when Alexander described the power of coordinating correctly, he says the person can readjust the parts of his body. My way of translating this is a bit different. I say that the person that can coordinate correctly can readjust the movements of the parts of his body. Because readjusting parts really makes no sense if you really think about it. We are discussing a mechanism made of moving levers, moving bony segments. And so we are not to readjust the parts by, I don't know, some sort of mental power that could change how, well, a bone does not respond to mental ideas. You have to be crazy to think something like that, that you could direct some influence toward a joint. No, but you can, well, decide how you want the different parts of the joint to move relatively to the other. So yes, you can readjust the movements of the parts of the body. The rigid parts of the body can be moved in different ways, and it's possible to use instructions in order to declare how we want a part to move. And so the second change I've made comes from Alexander himself, that is always using the term body in a strange way. He talks about the body and the limbs, the body and the legs, the body and the arms, and very, very often in his way of using that word, you find that in fact, inclining the body is also an expression that comes very often in the book, and he's discussing inclining the body of a person that is sitting. So when the person is sitting, inclining the body cannot be inclining the whole, what we consider ourselves as the body, or the body of the somatic people, which is the feeling body. You don't incline the feeling body when you're sitting, you incline the torso. So we can apparently, with the coordinating principles that are established by this technique, we can readjust the movement of the different parts of the body. And this is obvious that Alexander, yes, is able to readjust the different movements. So when you see Alexander, for example, leaning forward with his body in standing, you can see a simplicity. You can see something that is very, very clear, is that there is a back that is really flat as a board from the sacrum to T7. And you see that from there, yes, you could say that the head is forward, is projected forward and up. And I started to, well, compare the simplicity and with, for example, the same image as before with Marjorie Barlow. And then the simplicity is gone. Marjorie Barlow has the idea that if the neck and head relationship is more or less organized properly, then the coordination of the whole, which is a very complex thing that she does not address directly, she directs indirectly, and the coordination of the whole should be made perfect with time. So it's not a young Marjorie Barlow, and so I considered at that time, oh dear, oh my, this is me. I considered that well, her concept of primary control centered on the head and neck and back relationship was not working in practice, because she is clearly showing a coordination which doesn't really use the antagonistic pools. And we will see how important that is. What I can say is that if there are elastic system springs in the back, well, they have no action whatsoever. Well, springs have no action when they are not stretched. A mechanical spring will only give antagonistic pull, that is elastic resistance, when it is stretched. It is obvious that Alexander has simplified the system and has a very clear control of the movements of the different parts. He can readjust the torso to get that lengthening of the back, a lengthening of the torso going. So the shape and the function of support suddenly meet, because we see that to support the head, she has to retract the head. The muscles of the neck have to be retracted. Yes, there is no elastic system to maintain the upper torso above the middle torso. So there is a very distinct shortening of the muscles of the back. Yes. While in Alexander, of course, you can see that the weight, the load of the upper chest, of the shoulders, the arm, and the head is in fact projected forward and up in such a way as to continue to load the big elastic muscle of the back. So I started to have a conception of what it could be to lengthen the back. Why would we wanted to lengthen and widen the back? And this in itself started to bring some light in what Alexander is saying. So for example, he said, if at any point in the series, the chain of direction is broken and you is misdirected, all the succeeding acts of the series will go wrong, and the end will not be attained in the way desired. For instance, the golfer will not make a good stroke. In most people today, the direction of the use of their mechanism is not reasoned out, but instinctive. And in cases where this instinctive direction leads to faulty use, the connected series of acts preliminary to the gaining of any end will be brought about by a series of instinctive directions operating through faulty uses of the mechanism, so that a series of faulty acts will be the result. And so suddenly you compare the two images and you think that, well, yes, there must be a series of preliminary instructions that have to be given together for the lower torso, the middle torso to act together, while the upper torso and the head are acting as load. You must understand that there is a simplicity in activity on the right, while on the left, it's all it's all very, very unclear. There are too many actions. There are, of course, actions that are some sort of readjustment in order to compensate. So, for example, why is it that the head is not going so far forward from the back? Why is she retracting the head? Well, because there is no support. The function of support that comes through the form that Alexander has been able to perform using a series of orders is non-existent. Well, if it is non-existent, she has to, in fact, unduly lift the upper part of the torso to compensate. Because if she was really directing the head and the upper torso forward and up, well, the muscles of the back could not sustain that weight. So we see that we have a person that is using a somatic technique, and that is very different from somebody that is using a reason technique. And the reason technique is not only the reasoning of the different movements of the parts, it's also how to transform or these instructions, how to obey these instructions in action. Alexander is seen to be able to do that, while the somatic teacher is not. So I started to distanciate myself from the somatic technique because, of course, there was this strong force of the group. There were so many senior teachers, so many modern Alexander teachers that were believing in the power of the hands, believing in the fact that coordination is something you receive from a somatic transmission. Yes, but when I started to observe teachers around, I started to see that their conception of the position of the head, their conception of the lengthening of the back, well, was not really a simplification of the system. It was everything wanted to do what he wanted, more or less with the head in line with the back. I started to see a concept that is the plumb line. The plumb line is you can draw a line, and you will find that the back of the head is more or less in line with the sacrum. You can more or less trace a line. It's the straight back principle. Well, Alexander is not performing anything close to the straight back principle, as you can see. So there was now a choice, and I wanted to understand what were the mechanical difference, or the functioning difference between these two different approach of lengthening the torso. And that's where I started to investigate the old writings and also everything Alexander has said or written. And you come back to this image where you will see we are not discussing a book for once. We are discussing something Alexander said while giving a turn to a person during a presentation of the technique to the Bedford Physical Training College. So we are not discussing the young Alexander anymore. It's 1934. So the first training course has already started. And I was surprised to see that Alexander points to the center or the aim of the readjustment of the movements of the parts. Here is what he says. Before I explain, I need to explain that he's performing in front of a public with a young lady, and is requesting the young lady to go up on the toes. That's where we are. What this young lady is doing now is a very difficult thing to do. She's directing her head forward and up from here. Alexander indicates with his hand a part of her back. Knees forward and the hips back. And that is the only way you can get your antagonistic pulls. What interests me is to give her something to do by means of which she will put this head forward and the knees forward and the hips back. And so to get the antagonistic pulls working. By physical culture method, you do not get antagonistic pulls. And that is what is the matter. That is what is the matter. Antagonistic pulls. So I started to, well, observe the absence of antagonistic pull. That was easy. But to know what antagonistic pull could be was a different matter. There was only experiments. So I started to be interested with going up on the toes, because Alexander points out that if the person is not using antagonistic pulls, the person has to throw the middle torso forward. So I realized that, of course, we were discussing throwing the middle torso forward of the upper torso. And I was again back to this shape that is imposed by the modern Alexander technique on all his students, like myself. And I found that, yes, I could not go up on the toes without really an impulsion. And filmed, it was absolutely clear that I was going forward with the middle torso, forward of the upper torso. I was reproducing the same shape I had seen all my colleagues deploy as good use. But Alexander said it was not, which is quite strange. And he said it was not because there is a problem, is that you don't get the effect that he calls antagonistic pulls. So there is a direct link. It's like a system between the fact that you use instruction to obtain a certain shape and what this certain shape should give you. It's an indirect process, of course. You direct a series of movement and you should get something called antagonistic pulls. So this, I wanted to make sense of it. So I'm going to give you a resume, but you have to understand that I went to loads of interrogation, experiments, reading the books, trying to get my students to do new coordination of movement using series of instructions. And along the years, after 15 years, I have now a very, very clear idea of what Alexander meant by antagonistic pulls, which is where you will see quite simple, it's elastic resistance. So Alexander is discussing relaxation. And you will find that this is completely linked with what we have in mind. He says that the usual procedure is to instruct the pupil who is either sitting or lying on the floor to relax, or to do what he or she understands by relaxing. The result is invariably collapse. For relaxation really means a due tension of the parts of the muscular system intended by nature to be constantly more or less tensed, together with a relaxation of those parts intended by nature to be more or less relaxed, a condition which is really readily secured in practice by adopting what I have called in my other writings the position of mechanical advantage. Well, suddenly for me, the picture started to take shape, that the position of mechanical advantage that Alexander is displaying when he's leaning forward or going to squat, it's always the same. There is quite a mechanical simplicity there that I cannot find in the straight back or plumb line alignment of the modern Alexander teachers. And so the modern Alexander teachers, they really base their technique on a somatic approach where after a while, you will feel how to get the release. There is this idea that release is the tool that you're going to use to consciously direct into your system. So it's release of muscles, of course, in order to discover that the right thing will do itself when you stop contracting. So that's the main scheme of the modern Alexander technique. But suddenly, we have a different view here. We see that Alexander is not for release, is for due tension. And so there is in the center, you will see, there is this idea of due tension of the part of the muscular system intended by nature to be constantly more or less tense. Of course, when you translate this part, you have to ask yourself, what is Alexander talking about? I could not at first understand the sentence. I said, well, there are some muscles, parts of the muscular system. So I know that Alexander is not really precise when he say muscular system. In fact, I tended to translate this part and making muscular in italic or putting a question mark on it, and because Alexander was talking about the movement system. So the movement system is composed, of course, of the muscles. There are muscles, absolutely, but there are bones, yes, but there are also connective tissues that are connecting the muscular parts of the system to the bone. And if you stop a second and reason about it, you will find that there are parts of the movement system that are intended by nature to be constantly more or less tensed, never released. And these parts are the connective tissues. I read a few Alexander pupils that were talking of the spring, the main spring in the back, the spring at the front. And it was obvious that I'm talking, for example, of Gerald Stanley Lee. Gerald Stanley Lee is very clear about the idea of never releasing, never giving to that somatic idea. Is all about winding up the spring, the main spring of the back. And he had lesson with Alexander in 1919, 1920. So he copied everything from Alexander. So his unseen exercises are based on the idea to get the neck free, the head forward and up, and the back to lengthen and widen. The coincidence is great. He wrote his two books just 2 years after having 1.5 years of lessons with Alexander. So I started to imagine that, yes, a spring is intended by nature to be constantly more or less tense, because if it is not, it is slack. And if it is slack, it cannot provide any support. It cannot transmit any mechanical force. It cannot help you to go up on your toes. It cannot help you to stabilize the torso when you want to incline the torso, for example. So I started to think, okay, yeah, there is this thing. Maybe the shape Alexander is promoting by his coordinated instruction is a shape that should lead to benefit, to have these antagonistic pools working. And so if they are working for you. They are participating, or maybe sometime really achieving the goal, which is to give you the lift, to go up on the toes without any effort, to lean forward without shortening the torso. We have this idea that to not shorten the torso, we must say back to lengthen and widen. This is inherited from the modern Alexander technique. Most people have no idea that this could be negative instructions of what never to try directly, because it's impossible. It has to come from the means whereby movements which organized together are going to lengthen the torso. If the lengthening of the torso was realized by the antagonistic action on the different movements of the parts of the torso, which would, stretch the spring. And so there are springs in the back. There is a very complex system. When you look at the back, this is a dissection of the different layer that you would see on the back. And the first thing you see is this very nice shape. This is the outer layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. Well, at first, only with this image, you suddenly realize that, wow, the big muscles of the back, we have the gluteus maximus, we have the latissimus dorsi, which are connecting the arms and limb to the back. Well, these are not directly attached to the bones. They are attached to this enormous thoracolumbar fascia. Imagine that the gentleman here is trying to get the straight back of the modern Alexander technique. You will find that, in fact, this leads to having the middle torso thrown forward, and as Alexander said, the upper chest unduly lifted. So the sternum is going to be seen inclined backward at the top. Then you know that there is a shortening at the back. And suddenly the shortening at the back will, make you think that, yes, these parts are not stretched. These parts are slack. So the muscles now have to work twice more, because they have to shorten in order to produce any sort of stabilization activity of the arms and legs. They have to absorb the slack. It would be much better to organize the movement in advance so that, the slack does not exist, so that the thoracolumbar fascia, as it is attached to all the vertebrae, it can be stretched by moving the different bony parts of the torso. And you will find that we have not only expansion, widening, yes, resistance, so it's resistance to widening, but there is also, you will see the different layers. All the muscles are attached to it, but also all the spine is attached to it. So it means that there can be a resistance to flexion, a resistance to collapse. But there is a slight problem, is that this type of fascia does not function in parts. You have to organize the whole or get nothing. If you have a little shortening somewhere on the lumbar or the middle torso or the upper torso, unfortunately, you have a series of links that are elastic, and the strength of any link is going to be defining, the strength of the weakest link is going to define the strength of the whole structure. So it's necessary to start with an idea of working with the whole. You cannot just organize and get a professional organizing the top of the torso, the top, for example, the upper torso and neck, because this will create even more problems, because the lower part of the torso will have even more work to do in order to compensate for the slackness of the fascia in these parts. So we have now a new representation. So let me show you. I've seen how Alexander is performing a flexion to bring his arm forward. And suddenly I have an idea, a mechanical idea, which is a coordinating principle, if you want, that antagonistic pulls are the result of the antagonistic actions, antagonistic movement, if you want, that are applied to the different bones. And you can see that it's then possible to organize a mechanism without any muscular force. all is done by the myofascial chain that are organized together. And I suddenly started to think, yes, that's exactly what Alexander is performing. And the last throw was the wall procedure. In the modern Alexander technique, this idea of releasing is based on the somatic principle that you have to feel less tension. What if I wanted to increase tension? Not tension in the muscle, tension in the fascia. You must understand that fascia do not give much feeling. Fascia very poor sensory captors that can inform you. Of course, there are muscles that are implied. So yes, you will feel a few things. You will feel stretch. You will feel tension. Yes, so I had to first of all re-educate myself, because during my modern Alexander technique, it was like you know, no good to feel tension. You had to feel release. So suddenly, my problem was completely different. I wanted to feel tension. But this led to nowhere. So I started to see that there was a problem with this somatic concept of control, is that tension does not indicate stretch of springs. There is something that works much better. It's evaluating distances. I started to calculate distances, and I found that the shape Alexander was seen performing in standing was, well, a shape you can get, as Wilfred Barlow explained, with the wall procedure. You have here the wall procedure in reverse. I have added a blue wall at the back to show that it's perfectly compatible, but it's not by being on a wall that I adjusted myself and the skeleton you see here. It's by using measurements. I started to control not what I felt, but distances from different bony parts of the organism to a wall that was in front of me. And I started to discover that when I was able, so with ruler, wooden sticks, was not that difficult. Well, it was feeling horrendous, but I could absolutely get that shape. And I suddenly found that, yes, I was obtaining the sort of lengthening of the back that was necessary to stretch something, because suddenly I was capable of standing, going into monkey, and going into squat without losing either the length of the torso or the 20-degree inclination of the back to the vertical. And so suddenly I had a practical proof that Alexander was telling the truth, that it was possible to use instructions of movements coordinated together to change the form of the torso and to get a new functioning that was at first a new motor functioning. I was suddenly capable of going from standing to sitting, for example, in perfect poise, meaning I could stop the movement anywhere from the start to the finish, that I could arrive like 3 millimeters away from the chair and stop if I wanted to. Or I could sit and I could decide either to go back into upright sitting, so I could decide also to rise up without any sort of acceleration forward. Instead of acceleration, the elastic stiffness of the muscle was stored in these passive springs and was used as a catapult system to throw me up. Wow, I had found lightness at the end. I have found not lightness in itself, but how to construct this lightness. Lightness is not a feeling that is induced by fantastic hands. Lightness in action and is the consequence of very practical ideas that Alexander had discovered. So this is a long presentation, I understand. You may have to think about it, but you can always review it And if you have questions, send me questions through the mail. Any question?
Yes, well, a comment. It's interesting when you talk about fascia and you say that it needs to be changed as a whole. You can't just change parts of the fascia to create the spring. It shows that the link between theory and practice is all through Alexander. So people are used to, many people will know the phrase, a human being functions as a whole and can only be fundamentally changed as a whole. When he says that, it really means something. He's not just saying an idea. It's actually the principle that's involved in the required anatomical structure. That's correct. The theory and practice are the same thing all the time.
Yeah.
So it pays to go back and read Alexander again and actually think what he's meaning in terms of the practical procedures when he says things, because they're not just he's not just saying things or memes for the internet. He's really he's really much more clear than you when I first read him. It's not as clear now when you've explained stuff like this to me, and understanding the fascia and the spring system. It just makes a lot of sense what he says.
Yes. Well, it does. I just had to reconstruct the sense, because in order to make sense of what he says, you must have a representation that is close to his. And this is very difficult at first, because at first you're bumping into the modern Alexander technique idea. That is pretending to have the correct interpretation without any relationship with the books. It says that it's somatic, it's through the guidance, so you're bumping into that. But once you start constructing a representation and start constructing experiments where you can, in fact, demonstrate that the technique has a concrete aspect, well, then, yes, you go back to the books, and then, wow, you find so many things. It's a fact. I would instruct the listeners to start to have lessons first, a few lessons, and then go back to the books. Because going back to the books, like, everything is in the books. That's what Alexander used to say. Well, it's true when you arrive at a certain understanding of the representation Alexander had of the mechanisms. And because otherwise it will be very difficult to understand.
So what we're talking about here is, and it's too big a topic for now, but it's constructing a mental model for yourself. Yeah. So which obviously it's easier after you've had lessons. Okay, we'll stop here this week, Jeando. So for people watching the video, you'll get a link underneath where you can book a lesson with Jeando, and we will see everyone in the next video. Thank you, Jeando.
Thank you. Bye.